The title of this project is Arrest Networks and the Spread of Violent Victimization. And I'm using this title because it's the title of my original proposal. Since then, a couple things have changed. I've realized this isn't the most accurate title, but I haven't come up with one that's better. So for now, we're just going to stick with it. I think it gives the general idea, even if it's not quite as accurate as I would like. Right. Before I begin, I just want to acknowledge two colleagues, Lisa Broidy at the University of New Mexico and Brian Solar, currently at the University of New Mexico, but about to join University of Maryland, Baltimore County. And I want to both mention them because of their help and their feedback, and also that I can use the word we during this talk and not have you think that I'm just speaking in the plural for the next 20 minutes, okay? A little bit of background. The substantive focus that I have here is on violent victimization. And I think it's useful to start with saying that yes, we should think of violent victimization as a health outcome, not just a criminal or legal outcome. Violent victimization is going to be associated with obviously many times immediate physical harm, maybe even death, but it's also associated with long-lasting physical ailments and psychological outcomes, maybe stress, anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder. Like other undesirable health outcomes, violence is not randomly distributed. We find it more commonly within certain racial and ethnic groups, and we also find it in populations of lower socioeconomic status. And finally, I think there's a real need to study violence using social network analysis. When we think about violence, we're talking about an inherently social behavior. It's usually going to involve one person or group of people acting towards some other group of people. And we're starting to see research that suggests that incorporating information about network ties can be useful for understanding it beyond what we know from individual characteristics and ecological predictors. All right. So a lot of this previous research that's specifically on violent victimization and on network analysis looks at arrest networks, and much of it's done by Andrew Papachristos and his colleagues. And this research suggests that within arrest networks, being arrested with somebody who themselves has been a victim of violence puts a person at greater risk of being victimized. And the underlying logic here is that if you're arrested with somebody who is a victim of violence, you are likely to be exposed to the same risk factors. Maybe that's exposure to the same people that are willing to be violent, or exposure to the types of situations and conditions in which violence is more likely to occur. And this research brings up a lot of questions about what we know or what we can learn. So first of all, a lot of it looks at gunshot and homicide victimization, but it turns out that those are relatively rare. And so one question we have is, does our previous research on gunshot and homicide victimization, do those same patterns emerge when we think about more common types of violence? Another question we have is whether or not the previous research extends to different geographic locations. Much of this work has been done in cities like Chicago, Boston, Newark, and we know that other cities are going to have both different demographic profiles of residents, but they're also going to have different social histories. A lot of this research in particular has been done in Chicago, Illinois, which has been in the news for having higher levels of gang violence and fluctuating homicide rates. All right. So in terms of our goal here, it's to take information from law enforcement, looking at arrests, looking at victimizations, looking at events, and to try to construct a network to understand how violence interacts within this network. And we'd also like to add supplementary information from criminal courts and state criminal history databases in order to understand people's criminal histories, information from local emergency rooms in order to understand how violence basically flows out into the community and to capture some information that maybe doesn't come to the attention of law enforcement, and also information from the US Census. And this provides us information about neighborhoods and other contextual factors. All right, so at this point, I hope that you think that this is an exciting project, but I hope you're not too excited because I didn't actually do this. And the reason I didn't do this, there's a few things that happened. So first of all, these data are not publicly available. That's not to say that we can't get access to them. It is to say that getting access requires time, it requires effort, it requires social capital. Also, the current project is not grant supported. I'm an assistant professor at a large state university. I have teaching obligations. I also have a lot of research that really needs to get out before I go for tenure. And finally, probably the biggest issue is simply that we're not sure that a network approach is going to work here. I came to this workshop last year, and I discussed this project with a few people, including Jim and David Schaefer, and they both pretty much had the same immediate reaction, which is like, wow, this is a really promising project. Are you sure that you have enough ties to actually do it? When we think about offending and we think about arrests, one of the things we know is that most people aren't connected to anybody. And one of the things we know is that when people are connected to someone, usually it's just one other person. And so there's a real question of, do we go through the process of taking all these informations, different types of data, connecting them, applying network methods? Do we actually learn something we don't know before we do that? All right, so fortunately, I do have something to share. And that's results from a pilot project. And this pilot project is focused on violent victimization in criminal networks. We have approximately 3 years of crime-related data. This data are going to provide information about both offenders and victims, and it's from Albuquerque, New Mexico. And I'll speak more about this in a moment. The current goals of the pilot project are really twofold. The first broad goal is simply to take the pilot data and say, well, what can we learn about violence in criminal networks from these data? And today, I'm going to share a few preliminary results about this question of, do offending networks link violent offenders and victims? And then a second broad goal is to try to assess the feasibility of a larger project. Do these types of data actually support using a network approach to learn about violence in criminal networks? All right, a little bit about the data, brief overview. These are going to be criminal event data. They're going to have case numbers that provide identification of particular crimes or alleged crimes. And they're going to contain unique identifiers for individuals who are identified as suspects, arrestees, or victims in these data. Like I said, we have approximately 3 years of coverage from 2011 into the year 2014. And these data are going to be for the city of Albuquerque, New Mexico. Now, in terms of Albuquerque, in terms of why we're using Albuquerque, the most obvious answer is correct. It's because I'm at the University of New Mexico. This is the local law enforcement that was able to provide data. But it turns out that Albuquerque has a few other really nice features about it. First of all, as a city, it has over 500,000 residents. And when we're talking about violence and other types of rare events, it's important to have enough of a base rate that we can actually use statistical analyses. And so this is a bit promising. A second issue is that it's actually fairly easy to move around Albuquerque. So if nobody's ever seen it on a map, this is what it looks like. And it has I-25 and I-40 that run between it and basically connect in the center. This is referred to as the Big I. And because of these highways, and because there's so much spread in this city, it's actually fairly easy to move around. There's basically a joke where if you ask somebody how long it takes to get somewhere in Albuquerque, regardless of where you start and where you're going, they'll just say about 20 minutes or so, right? That's an amazing feature for a city. And one of the reasons that that matters in terms of network analysis is that we often have this underlying assumption that everyone in our network could potentially be linked to someone else. And we don't always do a great job of thinking about whether or not that's true. Now, in terms of Albuquerque, the fact is that regardless of where a person is, there is the potential for them to get somewhere else if they wanted to. Not to suggest that neighborhoods don't matter, not to suggest that people do bounce around that much, but we don't really have physical barriers or huge constraints that are stopping people. A third issue I just want to mention is that despite the fact that it's a fairly large city, and despite the fact that it's fairly easy to move around, it's also somewhat isolated. And I don't think that really the border here, the outline of the city itself is showing up. But this is what it looks like on a map. And so the important thing to note here is that once you go to the east of the city, you run into very large mountains. That once you go to the left of the city, you run into a national monument and lots of desert. Once you go south, you have an Air Force base, you have an airport. And this is just to say that for individuals who are offending within this area, we're going to have information on most of the offenses that the police know about within Albuquerque itself. Not to say that people can't commit crimes elsewhere, but just to say that we're not especially concerned about them kind of like inadvertently crossing over into another borough and then us missing information on them. If you're in Albuquerque and you want to leave Albuquerque, you kind of have to make a bit of an effort to get out of it. All right, I don't want to kind of bore people with numbers, but just to give you a sense of the size of the data and what we're looking at here, our information is taken from records. A record is going to be a case-person combination. We have over 150,000 of these. We have over 120,000 different cases. In these cases, we have over 45,000 cases that have a single offender and over 4,000 cases that have multiple offenders attached to that particular case number. And one thing you can probably figure out from here real quickly is that most cases don't have an offender listed. Most cases are just as someone who is reporting a crime to the police, and they don't have information about who the likely offender actually is. Within these data, we have over 120,000 unique person identifiers. One of the things is that people are listed as either a suspect or an arrestee. I'm going to combine them and just call them offenders for the purposes of this talk. We have over 40,000 separate offenders, and of those 40,000 separate offenders, over 8,000 show up multiple times with multiple case numbers. We have over 86,000 victims, and we have over 7,000 individuals who show up both as an offender at some point and also as a victim at another point. Great. So my substantive focus is on violent victimization and on this idea of violence. This is just an example of some of the offense types that we're labeling as violent, and I'm showing this for two reasons. First of all, in future work, we are hoping to look at differences between these different offense groupings, but today I'm just going to collapse them, and so you should probably keep in mind that even though I'm using the term violence, these results are really going to be driven by crime that's related to battery, and aggravated assault. They're just the far most common types of violent crime that we see in the city. All right, so building the network. Our network is going to be an offender network, and the idea here is that offenders are going to be linked through the criminal acts that they commit. And so the way we do this is we take our data that has information on both the unique offenders and information on the crimes that they're connected to. These are going to be two-mode data. And we're going to take these data and we're going to project it into a one-node network. And what this means is that our offenders are going to be our nodes or our vertices, and they're going to be connected to each other through edges or links that are determined by being a member of the same criminal case. The underlying assumption here is that if two people are suspects or arrestees for the same case number, there must be, or there likely is, some sort of social connection between them. And we make a few decisions with the data to try to bolster this assumption. So first of all, we remove cases where we have more than 10 offenders. We're saying that, yes, if there's some sort of crime and people are being arrested together, they should know each other. Maybe it's the case that if a whole lot of people are arrested, that's not true. We removed cases where an individual is listed as both the offender and the victim. The most common occurrence for this is that you'll see a single case number, and then in the records, it'll say person A is an offender, and person A is a victim, and person B is an offender, and person B is a victim. And what that suggests is that two people got into a fight. It might be the case that they knew each other before that fight, but it's also maybe the case that they didn't. Maybe the police showed up and basically said, okay, we're just going to arrest both of you, and also list you both as victims in order to charge the other person. And finally, we're going to treat these data as cross-sectional, at least at the moment. And the reason we're doing that is because we're saying that co-offending indicates a social connection, a social relationship, but we don't know how much before that event that social relationship began, and we don't know whether or not it continued on or ended after the event. So after constructing this offending network, we have over 40,000 offenders, and not surprisingly, over 32,000 of them are isolates, meaning they're not connected to any other offenders in the data, but we still have over 7,000 people who are connected to at least one other person. When we look at our ties, we're going to see that most people only have one connection. Down here, we have our degree distribution, removing the isolates since they're not connected to anyone. And as we can see, most people connected to just one other person. But once we get beyond that, we really do start to see that some people, at least, are connected to multiple offenders. And this type of pattern in our data is pretty common, where most individuals who are offenders are isolates, most who aren't isolates are connected to one other person, but we still have a non-trivial number who have more connections. And in fact, once we go to our component analysis, these are going to be subgroups where every individual who's within that subgroup can be connected directly or indirectly to everybody else. Removing the isolates, we see that most of these components are dyads. It's just two people who cannot be linked to other offenders. But we start to see much larger components. And even though they're more rare, there's still a meaningful number of them. And this goes to show the largest components. I'm cheating here a little bit because it shows more structure than you see in the whole network. But if I showed you the whole network, even removing the isolates, it's like all dyads. It's not very interesting. But this is to show this largest component with 53 individuals. We've sized the nodes to be equal to their degree. And it shows that, yes, there is some sort of network structure. We do have some people who are connected to more people. We do have some people who appear to be just connected to one other person. And it suggests that, yes, maybe we can use network analysis on these data. All right. So that's just a brief overview of kind of what the data look like. And now I just want to present some preliminary results from one of the questions that we're pursuing. And this is a question about whether or not victims of violence within the offending networks have ties to violent offenders. And we've seen this in other literatures that suggest that these links are going to suggest the spread of violence. The way we did that is we took our offenders and we labeled them as either nonviolent or violent. And this is going to be for all their offenses. So for people who showed up multiple times, if you do one violent offense, for our purposes, you're a violent offender. And then we also looked at information about whether or not they show up as victims of violence at any time. And so this says non-victim and victim, but it's really speaking about violence in particular. From this, we created 4 different labels. So we have our offenders who are non-violent offenders and also not victims of violence in this top corner. Down in the right corner, we have individuals who are both violent offenders and they themselves are victimized at some point. We considered all possible ties between these different groups. The matrix is going to be symmetrical. It's an undirected graph. And so then we said, well, what about the different connections that occur when one of the people is a victim of violent crime and connected to an offender who is an offender of violent crime? And these are the different types of connections that we have. And so we're asking, do these appear more frequently within the network? And so if we take that largest component and we were going to color it, and we were going to say, OK, individuals who offend are violent offenders are red, those who are victimized are blue, those who are both are going to be purple, it looks something like this. And what we're interested in is, are there ties between the red and the blue nodes that are more likely to occur relative to others? Are there ties between the purple nodes and the other purple, the red, and the blue? So the way that we tried to answer this question was through using exponential graph models. For those of you who aren't familiar with this, don't worry, you're going to get a lot of it this week. Very briefly, these models are trying to estimate the probability that our actual network is observed given the subset of all possible networks out there. And so y is going to be a random variable for the state of the network. G of y, the vector of network statistics for the model. These are basically going to be our covariates of the network. Theta is going to be a vector of parameters, essentially the coefficients that we apply to the network statistics. That's what we're estimating from the data. K being a normalizing constant that's going to represent, or that's going to be used to make sure that all the probabilities are constrained to sum to 1. Now, we're not interested in statistical inference for the entire network itself. We're really just interested in the likelihood of ties between dyads. And so fortunately for us, we can take our general model and we can re-express it as the conditional log odds of a single tie between 2 actors. All this really means is we can interpret our coefficients as the log odds of between actors I and j conditioned on every other dyad that occurs within the network. All right. This is a preliminary model here. The first three parameters are edges, isolates, and an actor covariate for numbers of offenses. Edges, what is just the likelihood of a tie between any two individuals? Clearly, it's going to be negative given how sparse our network is. Isolates is a term for the number of isolates that are in our model. The actor covariate is in there because we assume that individuals who enter the arrest data, the offender network, more frequently are more likely to be tied to others. But for our substantive question, what we're interested in is these different types of mixes between our offenders. And so the first one is asking about the likelihood of a tie between those who have been victimized but who are not violent themselves and others who are violent offenders but have been victimized. And we have no association there, suggesting that this tie is no more or less likely to occur given chance. The second parameter is for a tie between violent offenders who are not victims and non-violent offenders who are victims. And this one's actually negative, suggesting that we're less likely to see this relative to chance. And then our final two types of parameters here are for violent offenders who are victimized themselves at some point being connected to other violent offenders. And those two are positive. And so when we look at it, what it's basically saying is that in terms of answering our question, are people who are victimized, victims of violent crime within the arrest network, are they connected to violent offenders? The answer is yes, but only when they've been violent themselves. All right, so a couple of conclusions from this data so far. First of all, we have a presence of an arrest network, an offender network. We have ties. They're generally sparse, but they're not insignificant. We do have a degree distribution. We do have a number of subcomponents. We also see some amount of clustering of violence within the network. We have these ties between violent offenders and victims, but they only appear when the victims are themselves violent. And I would argue that this means that it's more likely to be a process of selection rather than the spread of violence, although I don't actually have an explicit test of either of those processes. That's one of the things that we'd like to look at with longitudinal data. All right, so just a few comments on next step. First of all, we're going to do continuing work with our exponential random graph models. These were just preliminary models, preliminary results. We are continuing to work on the model specification. That includes adding actor covariates for age, sex, race. It also means looking at goodness of fit. For those of you who are familiar with ergams, you'll notice I didn't present that. It's still a work in progress. In terms of the pilot project, we have a lot of future directions that we're going for. One of the ones that I'm most excited about is rather than projecting an offending network, projecting an event network. And so whenever I started out talking about the offending network, I said we had information on offenders and events, and we use it to project how people are connected to each other. Well, another thing that we've done is we've looked at whether or not different events are connected through people. And in Albuquerque, like in other cities, we have certain areas where there's higher rates of violent crime, but that doesn't mean that those other locations don't have any. And so one of the questions that we're going to be asking is, does the crime in those other places happen because you have a separate subset of offenders, or is it because you have one set that's basically spreading or linking violence between those different neighborhoods? And finally, in terms of the larger project feasibility, this question, do these data allow for network analysis? Is it, quite frankly, worth our time and effort to apply network methods? Do we learn something that we wouldn't learn otherwise? I would say our current mood is that we're cautiously optimistic about it, and we are going to make requests and hopefully receiving those other data in the late summer or early fall. All right, thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have.
If the cautiously optimistic approach works, do you see this as useful to identify potentially ways to think about child school violence. Not so much bullying, but the shootings that are happening a little bit.
If we're going to be honest, probably not. And that's because for those of you who have any background in criminology, our ability to be able to identify potential offenders, especially for rare events like that, is just very limited. And so I think that in terms of like what could this offer, kind of a public health or public violence perspective, is that I think one of the things that we can do is apply this information to the networks we have and potentially identify offenders who haven't been victimized yet, and probably let them know that, hey, there's a likelihood, given the information we have, that you're more likely to be a victim of violence, and to try to reach out and to do those types of prevention efforts. In terms of school violence, and again, particularly those very rare events, I know that they're awful events and they get a lot of media attention, but our ability to predict those, at least from these types of data, are really bad. So I wouldn't go that far.
And is there any way to use this to figure out the effectiveness of restorative justice practices?
There is. And so for that, we would need to bring in that information about, for example, court history, court information, criminal databases, and we would need to know about parole and probation and alternative sanctions. And if we have information about what individuals have or have not received that, we would be able to kind of continue tracking and look at questions such as, do those types of programs change their criminal networks? Do they change their likelihood of being violent themselves or victimized in the future?
Well, I think there's funding that's going to come out for looking at restorative justice and its effectiveness from the Department of Justice, if you are looking down.
Great, thank you.
All right, cool. I'm glad to see that there's at least cautiously that you kicked off in the whole room. The message was no bother.